Okay, in this video we're going to cover Savonarola and the dangers of extremism. So, some of you may be wondering, well, first off, who in the world is Savonarola? Well, Savonarola was a Dominican friar who preached very fiery sermons against the decadence and corruption of both Renaissance Florence and the Catholic Church. He's also known for organizing what's called the Bonfire of the Vanities, in which his supporters burned art, books, and other objects that were associated with temptation and corruption. Eventually, he became the de facto ruler of Florence and declared that Christ was king of Florence. So he said, we're going to have no ruler in Florence besides Christ. And of course, he saw himself as the spokesperson of Christ in Renaissance Florence. Eventually, his conflict with both the Pope and his strict moral rules led to his torture and execution in the year 1498. So, where did Savonarola go wrong? And I think there's kind of two big things here that kind of led people to eventually reject and torture and execute Savonarola. First off, I think the first thing can be represented through the red hat. And so what do I mean by that? The Pope, in an effort to kind of silence Savonarola, offered a cardinalship to Savonarola. And Savonarola replied, a red hat, meaning, the red hat that cardinals wear. He said, a red hat? The only red hat I want to see is the hat of blood. And so Savonarola had this tendency to give very inflammatory rhetoric, very passionate and kind of really fiery and inflammatory rhetoric, which on one hand really riled up his supporters, but on the other hand really made his enemies even more angry with him. The second representation of, I think, where Savonarola went wrong is a group called the Weepers. Okay, so the Weepers were a group, they weren't actually under the control of Savonarola, but they really listened to Savonarola and really liked his message. And so they decided, we're going to go out and enforce the teachings of Savonarola. So, and partially probably because of his fiery rhetoric that we just talked about, the Weepers went out and they would really enforce Savonarola's kind of strict moral code. So, if people weren't living up to Savonarola's code, they would threaten, intimidate, and really try to enforce Savonarola's teachings kind of through intimidation and violence. So between those two, between the fiery rhetoric and then eventually the violence and intimidation that came from the Weepers, the people ended up really rejecting and going against Savonarola. So in the end, Savonarola, I think he was really sincere, and a lot of people still today look at Savonarola as this paragon of purity and virtue and someone who really stood up for what he thought was right. But others kind of look at him and say, well, he was really extreme and maybe he isn't such a good example. So some questions I'd like you to consider as we finish off this video is, first off, what role does passion have in leadership? Can passion be taken too far? Second off, what role does tolerance have in leadership? And at what level should a leader look at those who disagree and say, well, even though I disagree with you, I'm still going to allow you to kind of do your own thing? Lastly, how can leaders kind of balance these maybe sometimes competing roles of passion and tolerance? So I'd love to see your comments on these questions, and we'll talk to you some other time.